there's one thing that Verge makes crystal clear for me, it is that we have the solutions. We know how to build a low-carbon economy. The challenge that climate action faces is not about what to do. It is about how to do it in a time frame and at a scale that actually matters for climate. And if I put it very bluntly, the underlying question beneath every session you go to here, every conversation you have, is who will pay for this? The fact is, all climate tech, whether it is to decarbonize a supply chain, remove carbon from our atmosphere, or even change how we think about carbon dioxide from a waste stream to a resource, all of that is developing in a context of great uncertainty. It's uncertainty about policy, political dynamics, social uncertainty, economic uncertainty. We're even unsure how we communicate about climate action. And when there is uncertainty, the most common reaction is inaction. It's no surprise. Why would we put our neck out there? We wait and we see what everyone else is going to do first. And of course, that is a recipe for not meeting any climate commitment. But not everybody is doing that. There are trailblazers, and they are all over this conference, and they are acting in this context of uncertainty. And I would actually argue they are acting in part because we are so uncertain. And so I'm thrilled to welcome two of those trailblazers here to our stage. Annie Guo leads nature-based carbon removal procurement at Microsoft. And Etosha Cave is the co-founder and chief science officer at the carbon transformation company, 12. So Annie and Etosha, I'm thrilled to have you with us. So I want to talk to you. How are you trailblazing here when there is risk and uncertainty at every turn? And I want to start with you, Etosha. You have been developing climate tech products for years, often out ahead of the market. What is your strategy for developing products when the market itself is uncertain?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. So first, wanted to say what we're building. So we are a technology company. We're doing carbon transformation, and we're mimicking nature in a process that we call industrial photosynthesis. So much like trees, we take carbon dioxide and water, and we use electricity and metal catalysts to break down the CO2 and water molecule into smaller atomic bits, and then reform those atomic bits into new molecules. And we also release oxygen. Those new molecules can become things like jet fuel or hydrocarbons that can be blended into some of the products that are in this room, like building materials, chairs, clothing. We're currently looking to scale up that technology. So we started off with a small system that is about the size of a dishwasher. We then built a skid system, and now we're building our first plant in Washington. And so to answer your question about how we think about de-risking that product and getting ahead of that curve was we realized the urgency of building this technology and scaling it up in industry. Right after we graduated from graduate school, myself and my co-founder, we worked together on the basic science side of this. And then leverage resources, first from philanthropic and the public sector, to really start to bring this technology so that once we were ready to start to deploy it, we could then bring in private partners who could already see the technology had been de-risked and could come and be partnerships with us.
Okay. Annie, you have been developing Microsoft's nature-based carbon strategy for a couple of years. I'm curious, what are the uncertainties that you have faced along the way?
Sure. So I think what I'm about to say is not going to differ from any other person who works within the carbon market space. I think one of the biggest uncertainties for us is just, will it work? And so I think maybe what's different about Microsoft is how we get comfortable with trying to answer that question for ourselves. And so pathway by pathway, we find ourselves asking, what must be true here? And so when we think about some of our engineered solutions like BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture storage, we're looking at like the feedstock, the sourcing of that, what must be true for us to be able to say that is sustainable. We're looking at the supply chain within the project in terms of where the feedstock comes from, where it's processed and the carbon is sequestered, how that's transported and ultimately stored, how secure is that storage. So we're asking ourselves along the way, what must be true for each of these pinch points for us to believe that the desired outcome is real, that we are storing carbon removal permanently. And on the nature-based side, we have the same kind of framing. When we think about the underlying parcels of land that underpin these restoration projects, we're asking ourselves, how can we assure, to the extent we can today, that these pieces of land will continue to support these, hopefully in the future, trees for many, many years to come? What about the project operator? Do they have experience doing this kind of work? Have they thought through their nursery supply chain, their seed sourcing? What must be true of these different pieces that are so material to ensuring that the restoration process is seen through and endures? And so we know there are a lot of other uncertainties that we could think about as a buyer. For instance, policy uncertainty or even just civil society and discourse uncertainty about what must corporates do. And I feel very privileged as a buyer on the Microsoft carbon removal team not to have to worry so much about those things in my day-to-day, because our business and our company back in 2019, 2020 took a look at its own operations and the story and our journey that is unique to Microsoft, and decided in partnership with in-house scientists and external experts that we believe in carbon removal, and we believe it comes last after we've exhausted every abatement solution we can come up with. And we've painted out these goals for ourselves to be carbon negative by 2030 and to remove historical emissions by 2050 from our operations since 1975. So those things and the groundwork for our program were laid well before I joined this carbon world, but now I get to just focus on transparently operating within that space that the company has created for me. And we just try to show our work and say, here's what we believe is true, here's what we think is good. We reserve the right to change our minds every year, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about how we've come to be more comfortable with some of the risks that are inherent to all of these projects. But ultimately, I do feel very lucky that we get to operate in this space and just try to do our best.
Okay. Etosha, you mentioned philanthropic funding as one thing that was really catalytic for you. I'm curious, what do you think we need to build the financial resources that will get these climate tech solutions to scale? And like I said, in a time frame that really matters for the climate clock that is ticking. So what do you see as the biggest levers we could pull to get finance to the solutions ready for scale?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had to really think about diversifying our financial stack. So we, start off with public and philanthropic funds. And then once we had de-risked the technology, we could attract private capital on the corporate equity side. But now that we're deploying our air plants, so we're building this end-to-end CO2 to jet fuel solution in Washington State, we then had to start thinking about project financing. So there's project equity, project debt, in addition to the corporate equity to kind of keep the lights on and keep the operations going. But what that project equity and project debt allows us to do, and in addition to public funds as well, so grants and so forth, what it allows us to do is to really meet the risk tolerance of the different capital where they're at, and recognize that we're building a first-of-a-kind system. So there is going to still be some risk inherent with that, and so having this risk diversified over different groups of capital, including our own corporate equity, really helped the appetite of each of the financiers to be able to join forces with us.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Mm-hmm. And Annie, I think every carbon project has some risk inherent. And as Microsoft builds up its carbon removal portfolio, that's a part of the game. So I'm curious, what are the risks that you are willing to take on, and how do you think about that?
Yeah. So as many of you probably know, we have this public list of what we consider to be high quality criteria for carbon removal technology pathways, and we've developed that in partnership with Carbon Direct. And so every year, as I mentioned earlier, we refresh that list of criteria, and we say every project that is restoration must have these things and perhaps should have these other components. And we have built from that internally just to create like a risk framework of sorts. So systematically, project by project, pathway by pathway, we have things that we're looking for, and we just at the end of the day, seek to go in eyes wide open. We know we can't solve all of it, but we know that if we kind of leverage the foundation of one of our cultural norms, which is growth mindset, we'll keep learning and we'll keep telling the world, here's what we're doing and why we're doing it. We reserve the right to change our mind, and most importantly, we seek to do no harm. That is one of the criteria in that document. So building on the question of what must be true so that we can be certain that these things are happening, we adapt that into a risk register that helps us systematically factor that in. I think ultimately we know a lot of things will come up that we don't expect, and it's really incumbent on me and my team internally to also represent the risks we see to our stakeholders in legal, in accounting, in finance, to our business leaders, because the worst case is something bad happens and we're surprised. And I want us not to be surprised. Even if we know there's a systemic risk that is present in this country or with this pathway, we want to codify what we can within our contracts to say, we expect your operations and your governance to play out like this. And if something happens that surprises us, hopefully we've mitigated the majority of the risks that could have emerged.
Well, I couldn't leave it on a better spot. Working with a growth mindset and moving forward despite risk and uncertainty. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret.